Sing it with a spirit that will start the world along. Sing it as we used to sing it, 50,000 strong, while we were marching through Georgia. Hurrah, hurrah, we'll bring the Jubilee. Hurrah, hurrah, the flag that makes us free. So we sang the chorus from Atlanta to the sea, while we were marching through Georgia. There were many Union men who wept with joyful tears when they saw the honored flag they had not seen for years. Hardly could they be restrained from breaking forth in cheers while we were marching through Georgia. Hurrah, hurrah, we bring the Jubilee. Hurrah, hurrah, the flag that makes us free. So we sang the chorus from Atlanta to the sea while we were marching through Georgia.
Whoa, what's this?
Crashed into a building. That's the 30th one this year. If they didn't put those buildings there, the road would be clear. Just driving along without a care. Next thing you know, a building is right there.
All right, so now we're getting set up here. Sorry, Barbara, I had to have the music so you had something to listen to while we got ready. Oh, Barbara's so hard to please. Hi, everybody. We're getting ready to do this. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, this is a rare free moment on YouTube. This is typically something that only our first lieutenants on Patreon will see. But it is everybody's got their tax returns and everybody's in a giving mood. And so we decided, let's show you what is going on over at Patreon. So today we're going to do a show about Reconstruction. We're going to do a series of shows about Reconstruction with our friend Richie Condon over here. And then those will be over at Patreon. And then they'll come out for free in a year, maybe 10, I don't know. But once they're all done, because there's going to be several episodes. So once they're all done, we're going to put them, then I'll start releasing them for free there. But I want to collect them. And, of course, the patrons are going to hear them first. And the first lieutenants get to hear them long before everybody else on Patreon does, too. So this is, whatever. Why do you want Rich to leave the hat on?
What?
I don't know.
Who's saying that?
I don't know. Eric Houston was saying, leave the hat on, Rich.
You don't like my hair?
I don't know. I like your hair.
Oh.
Maybe it's because you're embarrassing me because I have none. Maybe that's what it is. All right, Richie, let me just get a sound check on you there. Just talking to the microphone, please.
Check 1, check 2. Hi, Matt.
Okay.
Hello, Matt. Is it? How's that sound?
Oh, that's nice.
That good?
That's warm and rich.
Mm-hmm.
Warm and rich, and that is your name, Rich. All right, and Barbara says, sorry, I would just have silence. Same when you call companies for service. Oh, yeah, I know. Well, at least this is in high fidelity. I mean, when you get hold music, it's, it sounds like it's through a megaphone or something. You all right there with the coughs, Richie?
Yeah, I'm doing okay.
All
I
right.
just took a little cough drop.
Okay, so now this is stuff that we normally do before the show. We kind of just scope it out a bit here. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? So, I found this book here. This is the only book I have that has anything slightly to do with Reconstruction. Are you familiar with it?
I'm familiar with it. I have not read it yet.
Okay, it's called The South Since Appomattox, or Appomattox, if you prefer. And it is actually kind of interesting. It was written in the 60s. So there's two guys that wrote this book here. And today we're handling Reconstruction during the war.
Right.
So I'm assuming that means in occupied territories and things like that, right?
Correct. Yep.
And so there wasn't too much about this, but it did give me some idea as to what things looked like at the end of the war. And so I have a few excerpts that I marked that I want to read during the show, just to paint a picture of what the condition of this country was like. Do me a favor, grab that door. Don't shut it all the way. So we want to get some airflow here, but shut it enough so that I don't have that echo down the hallway there. Just like that. That's good. That's enough. Okay. All right, and so, but you're gonna lead the way. I'll try to feed you some stuff to get us started, and then I'm gonna just pepper you with questions as we go along.
That sounds great.
All right, very good. Then let's get it recording on the audio. We are recording on the audio, and we're gonna mute the microphones, and we're going to start the show. Barbara says, for some reason, I sort of lose interest once the war ends. Never been into Reconstruction. With you, Barbara, but stick around and you might hear my explanation and have your mind changed. Okay, here we go. That's the wrong button. Here we go.
From the Gettysburg Museum of History Studios,
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, everybody, patrons, and welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today we are about to embark on a new series of shows that we're going to do with our friend Richie Condon. You know how we've done those shows with Matt Borders about holidays during the Civil War and then the history of the Army of the Potomac year by year. Well, now we're going to get into something that we do over here on Patreon, which is we use Gettysburg as the springboard for learning about the rest of the war. And Reconstruction, you're saying, oh, that's after the war. What's up with that, right? What do we care about that? You might be also saying to yourself, the same thing I just said, but in different ways. And I would say to you, or you could say what Barbara said in the comments. She said, for some reason, I sort of lose interest once the war ends, never been into Reconstruction. Same here. But one thing I learned from doing this show is that our understanding of the Civil War and our country today, I think, has more to do with the Reconstruction period than the war itself. Would you agree or disagree on that one?
I would agree, but I would also say that you can't really talk about the Civil War without talking about Reconstruction. You can't talk about Reconstruction without talking about the Civil War.
Correct. They go hand in hand.
Right.
So I think in order for me to understand the way things are in America today and the way things were in the 20th century, mid-20th century, I'm thinking in particular, then you really have to understand Reconstruction. And so that's why we're doing this. But also, not more importantly, but just as importantly, is how we view the Civil War in the popular mind, and how we think of it, and how we think of the North and the South and the Confederates and the abolitionists and all these different groups of people, and the way we view them, I think, is a bit askewed from reality.
It's not quite as black and white as people think it is.
It's not, but also this idea specifically of the romantic South, and the idea that we get of the Southern warrior who's just fighting for home and hearth and all that stuff, and I'm not denying that there was that aspect to it. I think it's been magnified and over amplified over the intervening decades since the war, and I just feel like a lot of that has to do with the lost cause. Well, all of it has to do with the lost cause, and that is a product of Reconstruction. So as not today, but as we get going into this series, we're going to probably uncover a bit of that too. And I've also got some other shows about memory planned. So we will get into all this stuff. So sit back, relax, and join me as I learn, because I don't know a damn thing about Reconstruction, because like Barbara, I never really had an interest in it until very recently. And so if I can dust off an old corny line that I used to say at the beginning of shows, I'm learning, you're learning, so let's learn together. With Rich Condon. Richie Condon, tell us a little bit. Why are you such an authority on Reconstruction? Why are you on here?
So I will start off by saying that I did live in Beaufort County, South Carolina, which is home to Reconstruction Era National Historical Park. I did work there for almost 4 years. However, with that being said, and this is kind of a statement I have to give at the start of a program like this, anything I say, any of my opinions that I express in this show
and it will be used against you in a court of law.
are not official stances of the U.S. federal government or the National Park Service.
Right.
So I'm here on my own free time and free will.
And free will, yes. I do not have a gun under the table or anything pointed at you. You are here because you want to be.
Right. So, yeah, kind of going back, though, I worked at that particular park, but also, within the last 10 years or so, I've always, since I was 11 years old, been interested in the Civil War. And ever since I visited Gettysburg when I was 11 years old, I was interested in the Civil War.
Was this your first Civil War site?
Yeah. Actually, you know what? No. Balls Bluff in Loudoun County, Virginia.
Interesting, yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
That was my first Civil War site. And then it was Gettysburg. And then I kind of started going all over the place. But the older I got, the more I learned about the Civil War, the more questions I started asking. One of them being, why are these people shooting at each other in the first place?
Yeah.
And secondly,
that's a good question.
What happens when all that stops? Because it's not all done in a vacuum. It's not just, the Confederate Army.
War's over, everybody go home.
Yeah, no. Yeah. There's going to be a lot of ugly stuff that happens after that, and in many cases, a lot more personal.
Right.
So that's where my interest in Reconstruction began. And of course, when I moved to the South, and I've lived in various parts of the South throughout my 20s and early 30s, I started learning different Reconstruction stories in different towns and cities I lived in. For example, Nashville has an interesting Reconstruction story. Beaufort County, South Carolina has an interesting Reconstruction story. And that's really what we're going to focus on mostly today, because the things that are happening in these towns and cities during the Civil War will kind of lay the groundwork for what this is going to look like once the shooting stops from 1865 onward through the rest of the 19th century.
So before we get into that, because this is during the war, if you'll indulge me here, I want to read this to the audience just to kind of set the stage of what things looked like at the end of the war. Now, for those of you who have been to Virginia, I've been there a million times. I grew up going there. I have family there. Beautiful, beautiful, lush state. But we're going to hear a little bit about this in the second paragraph. So let me just, this is long, but I think it's worth reading to you here. So here we go. This is already in progress, talking about Sherman's March to the Sea. He says, Sherman would miss Charleston, leaving its destruction to other conquerors, but his army burned in whole or in part Robertsville, Grahamville, McPhersonville, Barnwell, Blackville, Orangeburg, Lexington, Winnsboro, Camden, Lancaster, Chesterfield, Cheraw. Did you ever hear that?
Cheraw, yep.
Cheraw. And Darlington. A correspondent of the New York Herald traveling with Sherman wrote, quote, "The middle of the finest day looked black and gloomy, for dense smoke arose on all sides, clouding the very heavens. As for the wholesale burnings, pillage, and devastation, magnify all I have said of Georgia some 50-fold, and throw in an occasional murder, and you have a pretty good idea of the whole thing," end quote. There is doubt as to whether the firing of Columbia was caused by Sherman or by Wade Hampton's retreating Confederates. Now, I don't know if this has changed since then. This is written in the 60s. But there is no question of the extent of the damage. 80 city blocks, including 1,386 buildings, were completely destroyed. Destruction in other regions rivaled that of Georgia and Carolina countryside. A visitor to the Shenandoah Valley after Sheridan's final campaign there reported that the Upper Valley was a scene of desolation. Quote, from Winchester to Harrisonburg, scarce a crop, turn the page here, sorry, or fence was in sight. The country between Washington and Richmond was like a desert. Members of the Congressional Joint Committee on Reconstruction visiting the valley in 1866 were assured that there was no danger to new crops from foraging cattle because Sheridan had the foresight to remove all the cattle and horses. Indeed, the lack of draft animals after the end of fighting forced the people to resort to primitive methods of cultivation. Lone and blackened chimneys of once happy homesteads stood watch over the ruins of what had been rich forests of oak, hickory, chestnut, and pine. Entire villages, like Raccoon Ford and Stevensburg, disappeared, never to be restored. This goes on, but let me skip to the end here because this is longer than I thought it was. Where is the thing here? Okay, here. But even the desolate countryside failed to tell the full tragic story. This had to be seen on the faces of the people. Every one of them, wrote a northern traveler, was a record of some phase of the contest, of its squalor and misery, of its demoralization, of its barbarism, of its ennoblement. Bright, fair faces that ought to have adorned happy rural homes, grown coarse and brassy, flaunted beside young officers. They were the transformation of the camps, the result of license and lax morality. And aimless young men in gray, ragged and filthy, seemed to have lost all object in life. Quote, by the roadside here and there might have seen a poor, half-starved, half-naked white woman gathering her little children about her and cowering in the gray dawn over the dull embers by which she had watched through the wretched night. In an agrarian society like that of the antebellum South, ravages of war are erased from the land more quickly than in urban industrialized countries. Even so, it would be long years before physical reminders of the devastation disappeared from the southern countryside. An Englishman traversing the Tennessee Valley, and this is the end here, in 1870 noted, plantations in a state of semi-ruin and plantations of which the ruin is total and complete. The trail of war is visible throughout the valley in burnt-up gin houses, ruined bridges, mills, and factories, and in large tracts of once cultivated land stripped of every vestige of fencing. The roads, long neglected, in many places have become impassable. New tracts have been made through the woods and fields without much respect to boundaries. Of course, this goes on. It's a long book. But I wanted to read that because that's the end of the war. But now we're talking about during the war, but they're still in places where the war was going on. Is the scene as bad at this point where we're going to be talking about?
So I'll first say, and this is something that when you ask someone what their understanding of Reconstruction is, they might describe a scene such as that, and the literal rebuilding of towns and cities throughout the South.
Yeah.
That is not what a Reconstruction is necessarily.
Oh.
It's not a physical reconstruction of the South. It's a rebuilding of the foundations of this country, you know, during and after the American Civil War.
So that's interesting. So we think of it as building the cities that we destroyed during the war, but it's rebuilding society,
Exactly.
an economy, civil rights, everything. We're rebuilding the country, including in the North, even though it wasn't ravaged by war in the same sense.
Right. A lot of, society is being reshaped. You know, we're starting to think about what is this country going to look like at its foundation once, like I said before, once the shooting stops. Are we now? There's going to be almost 4 million people who were once held in bondage free. What does that look like?
Right.
What happens with them? So and of course you have the white Southern oligarchy, these people who own the big plantations in the South. What is that? What is class going to look like once the war is over as well?
Yeah.
And so these are all questions that arise when we start to talk about a Reconstruction. What what are these towns, cities, states going to look like?
When you list it all like that, it sounds like the rebuilding of bridges and railroads and roads and buildings and fences and everything
And sure,
else is the least of it all.
Right. Logistically speaking,
That's
sure,
the easy part.
Those are things that will be done.
Yeah.
But really, it's why did this all start in the first place?
Right.
And how
do we
gonna,
not? We don't want to go back to
Right.
the problems that caused it. We want to.
Well, some people do.
Well, yes, of course.
But yeah, and I think as you're kind of reading from that, I just wanted to share, and this is a famous quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, who had actually written. I have one of his books right here. If you can see it on the camera there, Black Reconstruction in America. And I really think this is one of the first true tellings of the story of Reconstruction, because there's, of course, many different narratives that are flying around in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. You talked about the lost cause narrative or lost cause movement during Reconstruction.
Right.
This is laying out as I mentioned, a kind of a truer telling of Reconstruction, how it's unfolding. But the way he puts it very simply is the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. And that's kind of the story arc of Reconstruction, where, there are, and this is what we'll talk about, here kind of in wartime Reconstruction, is that groundwork is laid out for, ideally, when this is all over, what's it going to look like? How are formerly enslaved people going to move into a functioning society? What opportunities are they going to be given? What kind of power can they be given? And sure, in many places they are given power and rights. Equality is kind of it's going to take another century for that even to take hold.
Right.
But after all that's over, and say toward the end of the 19th century, new state constitutions are written, and we'll talk about this much later on. We are launched into the era of Jim Crow, which lasts into the 1960s. So again,
Sure.
a century after the war is over. What does that look like? And that is, like I said, just described by W.E.B. Du Bois in that one quote.
And we'll
sum up Reconstruction.
We'll dive into that stuff in future episodes.
Right.
But now, go ahead with what you've prepared for today.
Sure. So, as I mentioned, there's, during the war, Reconstruction is playing out in a multitude of places. As I mentioned, Beaufort County, South Carolina.
Wait, I got a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's playing out. Are they making it up as they go along? How do they know what to do?
Oh, that's a good one.
Thank you.
Sorry, there's the consumption.
You're a lunger.
So, and there's a reason that it starts to play out the way it does in, say, Beaufort County, South Carolina, or Port Royal Sound, South Carolina. That place in particular is a place that, of course, South Carolina is the first southern state to secede from the Union in December of 1860. A lot of the wealthy white planter class who live amongst the Sea Islands have their plantations in the Sea Islands of South Carolina. The people who are, in this hotbed of secession in Charleston, for example, these are the people that are kind of laying the groundwork for secession from the United States. These are the folks that for some time had been thinking about secession. And all this secession, of course, is rooted in the institution of slavery. Slavery, just to kind of make it short, the newer Republican Party in the 1850s is looking to restrict the expansion of slavery in Western territories, and this is seen as a great threat to those who, of course, are making their wealth on this institution. In that part of the country, the major staple crops are rice, Sea Island cotton, which goes for quite a bit of money. And so the labor force is almost entirely enslaved. In the South Carolina Sea Islands, for example, there's about 10,000 people on just a small area of what we now know as Beaufort County, South Carolina. Well, kind of fast forward, once South Carolina secedes, the war erupts in April of 1861. The first shots being fired at Fort Sumter, not very far from where all these plantations and plantation owners are located. The U.S. government looks at this area where, the idea of secession was born, where, of course, this first violent act against federal troops is carried out at Fort Sumter. And they figure, well, maybe this is a place where we can make an example of those who raise the sword or the gun against the United States government. So, long story short, by the fall of 1861, U.S. Troops, specifically the Navy, along with the Army, are going to assemble a flotilla of 77 U.S. ships. They're actually assembling them near Fort Monroe, Virginia. And they're sending them down toward the South Carolina Low Country, toward what we now know as Beaufort County, South Carolina, for a couple of reasons. Of course, like I mentioned, it's this hotbed of secession. But also, logistically speaking, you have Port Royal Sound, which is the deepest natural harbor on the eastern seaboard, second to New York City. And this is about the time that the U.S. Military is starting to lean into Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan, and this idea where, if we were to establish a blockade around all these ports, we can strangle the Confederacy to death, prevent them from sending out exports, et cetera, et cetera. So this is all part of that Anaconda Plan. As they're assembling this fleet around Fort Monroe, word is starting to spread down to the people of the South Carolina Sea Islands. In fact, a lot of them will start to pack up their things and flee inland. A lot of these people don't just have that one home where they're harvesting cotton or enslaving people to harvest cotton. They also have a home in maybe Columbia, South Carolina, the state capital, or even Georgia or elsewhere. So a lot of them start to pack what they can within reason, and they start to head inland. In fact, a lot of them will try to take with them those they've enslaved. And they will actually tell a lot of these people, listen, if you stick around here and the Yankees come down to South Carolina, they're going to send you to Cuba. They're going to, throw you in the ocean. They're going to, basically do anything horrible and unimaginable you can think of. And, for some people it works. For a lot of people it doesn't. A lot of them see this as an opportunity. Well, maybe that could happen, but I'm willing to take my chances. It's better than doing what I've been doing my entire life here.
Yeah.
So, a lot of people do stick around. They might flee to the woods until their enslavers have gone to whatever other property they're going to. And then, between late October and early November, this naval fleet is coming down the eastern seaboard and heading straight for Port Royal. The idea here, too, is if they can establish a naval station right there in Port Royal Sound, they can establish the blockade of Charleston, which is, of course, another major port, and Savannah, which is not too far south of there. They eventually arrive the first week of November. They hit some rough seas and storms, but once the weather clears up on November 7th, 1861, this naval fleet is going to engage two Confederate fortifications that are one on Hilton Head Island and one on Bay Point, about 2 miles apart, roughly. But in a matter of about 4 hours, these naval ships drive out all the occupying Confederates. By the end of day, they're going to land troops on Hilton Head Island. And this is really where Reconstruction begins in November of 1861, a lot earlier than a lot of people realize.
Interesting.
And the reason I say this is because when they're arriving, you have people who had run away from their enslavers greeting U.S. troops on the shore, and they're asking all these questions. Am I free now? Can I go to school? When do I get to carry a gun? When do I, if you're familiar with Glory, when do I get to wear the blue suit?
Right.
All these questions are starting to pop up, and they're asking these questions to, a young soldier from Pennsylvania or New York or New Hampshire.
He's like, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
But neither does his general, right?
Right.
They don't really
So,
have a plan for that.
Commanding these troops, you have Samuel F. DuPont, Admiral Samuel F. DuPont. He's commanding the naval fleet, and they're working in tandem with U.S. troops that are commanded by Thomas Sherman, of no relation to William Tecumseh Sherman. And when Thomas Sherman arrives, he's actually explicitly saying that we're not here to disturb the institution of slavery. Interestingly enough. However, people can see how this is already playing out. You know, when you have the white plantation owners fleeing, a lot of the people they called property staying behind with the hopes of having some kind of freedom. This is already laying the groundwork for Reconstruction, and all those questions they're asking are laying the groundwork.
Are they leaving them behind so that they can continue to work? Is it like what do they leave? Why are they?
They don't know what's going to happen. I mean, the people who leave, they have either pushed for secession from the Union or support it, and either way, that is
so they're just they're saving their asses
basically. Yeah,
okay.
It's considered treason,
and bringing all their slaves is going to slow them down.
Well, no, they try to get as many of them to come with them as possible. Yeah,
okay.
Because they consider them to be valuable property.
Yeah.
But of course, like I said, a lot of people will stick behind in hopes that maybe this means a better life.
Yeah, okay, got it.
And so anyway, all these questions that started to arise, this is kind of where the foundation of Reconstruction is born.
Right.
But of course, when U.S. troops are arriving on the South Carolina coast, they aren't really prepared for the challenge with which they're met. They're going to need a lot of outside help, in fact. So once they start to move in and settle in on the South Carolina coast, they start to expand their footprint. Not only are they on Hilton Head Island and Bay Point, they start to move to the surrounding sea islands, which are actually all cut off from the mainland. There's no bridges that go between the islands like they are today.
Right.
You had to take a ferry or a boat. Right. They're all cut off. This is kind of a perfect little bubble for them to operate in, and this becomes kind of a test tube for Reconstruction. In fact, months later, come spring of 1862, they're going to start calling for help from northern missionaries, from doctors, from teachers, you name it, who, there's plenty of abolitionists in places like Philadelphia, New York City, Boston, who are all, for years, have been talking about this idea of trying to help the enslaved.
Right.
Well, now this is the opportunity for them to put their money where their mouth is.
Yeah.
And so by April of 1862, there are boatloads of them being shipped down to South Carolina from those major ports. And they start to open schools. They start to establish hospitals.
Which we also see in Glory, don't we?
Yes. And actually, and I think Glory is maybe one of the earliest depictions of kind of the fringes of Reconstruction that we're seeing.
Yeah.
You see contraband camps, for example.
Right.
And there's, of course, once the Union Army establishes this foothold, and like I said, there was about 10,000 people enslaved on the islands. Wherever they are, they're starting to encounter more people who are fleeing plantations inland and heading for the sea islands. Once they hear that the Yankees come to South Carolina, they start to flee within their lines. So by 1865, that number of 10,000 has almost tripled.
Wow.
And so, of course, like I said, they need help outside of the U.S. War Department to try and figure out a way to not only give them, say, an education. This is something that they're prevented from receiving by law, by state law.
Right.
You're not allowed. It was illegal to learn how to read and to write.
Right.
It's illegal for a group, I believe, larger than 4 African Americans to gather without a white person present.
Really?
So obviously that makes worshiping freely pretty difficult.
Yeah.
So
you'd have to have a white. What would you have to have? One white person per 4 people?
Well, if it's a
like
group
what was a
than,
white preacher in a church?
Then that'd
That's
be
okay.
fine with them.
Okay.
But it's usually like, for example, on a plantation, they would have like a praise house, or a chapel of some sort, and they would need a white man to be present for that.
Oh, not just a white person, a white man. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah,
right.
Of course.
So, but you have a lot of people who are enslaved who will worship secretly, out in the woods or have like a smaller structure that they might gather in secretly. But with the start of Reconstruction in the Low Country, there are churches that are being actively built, and people are able to kind of worship on their own finally. But these are all different aspects of Reconstruction that are taking root as early as 1862. Not to mention the fact that they weren't allowed to own any kind of property before, really.
Right.
They start to actually be paid by the U.S. government for different services. You know, if you're working as a teamster for the Army, for example, if you're building fortifications, you name it, they're finally starting to receive wages in 1862 for their labor. So now we're establishing a wage system.
Right.
And not to mention you have the United States Treasury Department coming in, not just the War Department here, but the Treasury Department is sending in tax commissioners. They come to South Carolina. They're looking at all this abandoned property, and they are going to start placing a price on it. They essentially are going to release a statement saying, you know, within 60 days, you have to pay taxes on your property. This is declared to be, yes, this is an area of insurrection. If you don't pay taxes on that property that you've abandoned, it's going up for sale. It's going up for auction.
Right. Okay.
And, you know, by early 1863, you know, not many people actually come back and pay those taxes because you actually have to come back in person and physically pay your taxes.
Right. Who wants to do that?
Out of, you know, 200 plus plantation owners, I believe somewhere around 10 to 12 will come back.
Really?
Yeah. So the rest of it, though, is going to be auctioned off, and now they've been paying these people who were once called property in the eyes of the law. They're now being paid wages. Within a year, they're able to afford some kind of property.
Now, the ones that did come back, do we know who they are, and do we know where they?
I don't have their names off the top of my head, but
I mean, do we know anything about them? Like, were they pro-union or no? Okay,
not necessarily.
Okay.
No, but you know, at the end of the day, they want to maintain their property. That's, you know, with the exception of people, they could come back and get their land, but they can't reclaim people as property. That's
right.
the catch.
Okay.
Yep.
So you can save your.
You can employ people.
Yeah. You can save your real estate, but you cannot save your real people.
Right.
Right.
Right. So, but like I said, the rest of it, this is all going to be auctioned off.
Okay.
And so this is where the idea of, you know, financial autonomy and land ownership come into play.
Mm-hmm.
And this will actually lay the groundwork for, if anyone's familiar with the term 40 acres and a mule.
Yeah, sure.
So January 1865, William Tecumseh Sherman, from his headquarters in Savannah, Georgia, he will issue orders number 15, which declare that, you know, 40-acre plots between Charleston, South Carolina, all the way down to the St. Johns River in Florida. Families who establish themselves in these 40-acre lots can stay there and basically work off the debt to own that land. This is all land that was abandoned by, you know, the former wealthy white elite.
Uh-huh.
And of course, that all kind of began though in the Sea Islands. This is one of those foundational building blocks.
So, see, that's interesting. It's fascinating that it started basically right away. Like before right away. November of 60 or 61.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, it was a little after. But yeah, that's early.
These people though are not, they're kind of living in a gray area that first year and a half or so. They are not recognized as freed people in the eyes of the law. They're, in fact, if you read most contemporary accounts, they're referred to as contraband. And so we think of contraband, we think what? Confiscated property, right?
Right, sure.
Which, interestingly enough, the term is born from the area from which the fleet that captured Port Royal Sound originated there at Fortress Monroe in Virginia. In fact, in May of 1861, General Benjamin Butler, who's commanding Fort Monroe, takes in 3 men who had escaped Confederate captivity.
Mm-hmm.
These guys were, you know, working on trenches, earthworks in the surrounding region. They had fled the Confederate Army. They arrive at Fort Monroe. They're taken in, and I believe the following day, Confederate officers arrive at the fort and essentially say, "Hey, you have something of ours."
Right.
And, you know, Virginia had seceded by that point. So if they're trying to enact the 1850 fugitive slave law that says you have to
Return them.
well,
That's a United States law.
yeah, you don't consider yourself part of the United
Right.
States.
Yeah, I love
And
that.
if we're going to call them property, we're going to call them confiscated property. We're going to call them contraband of war.
Yeah.
And so those men stay at Fort Monroe, but this also opens the doors for so many other people to start moving into Fort Monroe.
Right.
And so, again, you can say Reconstruction begins at a place like Fort Monroe, which ironically, if you look back in time in 1619, this is a place where some of the first enslaved people are brought into what would become the United States.
Oh, how fitting.
Right.
Yeah. Huh.
So, but, the fleet that leaves around Fort Monroe and heads down to Port Royal Sound, they bring this term with them, contraband. So you hear it very often, very commonly used in what would become the Department of the South. And I'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
One of the people that's at Fort Monroe actually in May of 61 is a guy named Edward Pierce. He is going to essentially be placed in charge of the welfare of a lot of these people that are coming in into Union lines. And because of his experience at Fort Monroe, once a Union foothold is established in South Carolina, he's brought in to do the same thing there, but on a much larger scale. And basically helping establish parameters for things like free labor, education, et cetera, et cetera. Like I said, once all this is established in South Carolina, by the spring of 1862, once you have those teachers, those doctors, those missionaries coming into the Sea Islands, you're also going to have a new military department established as they start to establish this foothold. And so this military department will basically consume the lower coast of South Carolina, Georgia, into Florida, northeast Florida, and it's going to be called the Department of the South. And placed at the head of the department is David Hunter.
Yes.
Or as people know him, Black David. David Hunter, if you're familiar with his background, is a staunch abolitionist. In fact, I believe in the summer of 61, when he's stationed out in Missouri, he tries to free enslaved people. He's going to try something very similar here in the Department of the South. And this is, of course, before the Emancipation Proclamation, before the United States government is taking an official stance on the abolishment of slavery.
Right. That's what's so
altogether.
fascinating is that, there's nothing on the books really on how to deal with this and what to do with all these people. And so you got is it basically at this point at least up to the local commander what you do? Like basically what's practical to do with the situation I have in front of me as the commander?
They are figuring this out as they go along, but they're also, of course, they have to do it with the blessing of the federal government, the blessing of Abraham Lincoln, of course.
Well, so what is the federal government's reaction when they hear about all this?
So, this is sanctioned by the federal government.
Okay.
What's going on right now?
So
But
in
like
other
I
words,
said,
but what happens first? The armies have to deal with this influx of contraband.
it's very reactionary.
Yeah. So that happens first, and then the government has to say, well, we need to codify this somehow. Or-
Right. And so, the Emancipation Proclamation, of course, the idea of it isn't brought about until the summer of 1862.
Right.
Of course, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is released in September of 62, but doesn't go into effect until January 1st, 1863.
Right.
Up until that point, these people who were formerly enslaved but not quite considered free yet are still living with this title of contraband that's been, kind of bestowed on them by the federal government and U.S. troops that are stationed in the Department of the South and elsewhere. In fact, around the same time that this is going on, by April of 1862, U.S. troops actually break through in New Orleans, and they'll take that major city, major port city as well. And this is another place where Reconstruction kind of takes a foothold too. But as I mentioned, a lot of the examples we're going to use today are in South Carolina specifically. After David Hunter takes command of the Department of the South, he starts to move pretty quickly. In fact, about a month later, U.S. troops are going to capture Fort Pulaski, which is just outside of Savannah, Georgia. And at Fort Pulaski, of course, you had people who were enslaved. He's going to issue orders number 7, which basically declare all enslaved people at Fort Pulaski and Cockspur Island, where Fort Pulaski is located, to be free. And he announces that any men who seek employment can be employed by the United States military, et cetera, et cetera. And so this kind of plants a seed for things to come. About a month later, in May of 1862, David Hunter issues orders number 11. And this is kind of on bigger scale. He says, all enslaved people in my department, meaning enslaved people in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, where U.S. troops are stationed, are now considered free. He didn't have the federal authority to do so. That's, of course, that authority comes from the President of the United States.
Right.
So he'd kind of just gone ahead and did that.
Right.
And, Lincoln actually finds out through Northern newspapers that Hunter had issued these orders and basically says, I never gave my blessing for this. In fact, when Hunter issued those orders, he also issues orders to start arming black men from the Sea Islands.
Wow.
Again, that's not something he was necessarily authorized to do.
Right.
But this also kind of brings in another facet of Reconstruction where, one of those questions that people are asking when U.S. troops land on Hilton Head Island is, when do I get to wear the blue suit? When do I get to fight for my freedom, the freedom of others?
Yeah.
If you're looking at black men who are born free in the North, they're trying to enlist at the very start of the war and are being denied actively by the War Department because of the color of their skin.
Yep.
These guys are fighting for this idea of citizenship and equality. So they have a lot of course, they have so much skin in the game. And they're finally having an opportunity, at least in that area, to pick up the rifle to enlist. And at least David Hunter is giving them this permission, but the federal government's still kind of not ready for it.
How about John C. Fremont? What's he doing?
John C. Fremont, so Hunter is actually under Fremont in Missouri when they were looking to enlist, declare people free and enlist them. So around that same time, you have the first Kansas Colored Infantry,
right?
Which is another.
So that they're that old, that regiment. They go back.
The first Kansas goes into, I believe, the fall of '62.
Okay.
But the very first men to pick up a rifle to wear the blue uniform is the 1st South Carolina Infantry, and these guys are all from the Sea Islands.
Okay.
And a lot of people refer to them as the Hunter Regiment, because he saw it as kind of this project that he wanted to implement right off the bat when he got down there. And he waited about maybe 2 months before he started enlisting this regiment. But these are the first men to enlist in the what would become the U.S. Army. They weren't federally recognized actually until later in the fall.
Okay.
Even though they recruited them in May.
Okay.
So basically, Hunter is arming them and clothing them with the resources he has at hand at the time in the summer of late spring, early summer of 1862. But they aren't federally recognized till much later on.
Got it.
So, but again, this regiment, men joining the army, this becomes kind of a place for them to learn how to read and to write. They have people, for example, Susie King Taylor, who is a woman who was enslaved actually at Fort Pulaski, who was freed in April of '62. She's 14, 15 years old, learned how to read and to write in Savannah illegally. And she actually had been teaching at a school a little bit south of Beaufort County. When she joins the regiment at their camp in Beaufort County in later '62, she's teaching these men how to read and to write. So this becomes a place where they not only learn school the soldier and how to fight in formation, but they're learning the things that they had sought out and been seeking out for years prior to the first shots at Fort Sumter.
What is the reaction of the white soldiers when they're the contraband are being employed or armed?
There's mixed reactions.
Okay.
And, you can look at this case and easily understand that a lot of the guys who came here, say in December of 1861, are not abolitionists, the way they write about these black soldiers being recruited
Right.
from the Sea Islands. They talk about them as if they're subhuman.
Mm-hmm.
But also, these guys a lot of them never encountered an African American before. They'd especially never encountered an enslaved African American. So they had different ideas of what they were and what they should be in their minds. Now, there are, of course, quite a few people who are abolitionists as well. These people who are starting the schools, those missionaries who came here in early 1862. And when they start to recruit, say, the 1st South Carolina, and there will be more regiments, recruited and trained in that region, the guys who are going to become commanding officers, company commanders, a lot of them, initially, it's kind of a mixed bag. Some guys are abolitionists who really want to see these black men fighting in the Union Army. Some of them do it because it's a promotion. They might have come down with a regiment where they were a corporal or a sergeant, and now they have an opportunity to be a lieutenant or a captain,
right.
for example. And they start to weed those guys out over the next year or so. In fact, the colonel of the regiment, who eventually takes command in November of 1862, is a guy named Thomas Wentworth Higginson. And
it's a British name.
Have you heard the name before?
No.
Okay. So Higginson's actually a pretty interesting guy, and if you have heard his name, he is associated closely with John Brown, the John Brown.
Okay.
He is part of the Secret Six, as they'll be dubbed.
I've heard of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Higginson is he's a minister from Boston area. In fact, he in the 1850s, during the Bleeding Kansas era, he is supplying weapons and money to John Brown and Free Staters. And of course, once John Brown is planning his raid on Harper's Ferry, the U.S. Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, he basically does the same thing.
Yeah.
And, the Secret Six, these guys who had been supplying him, most of them actually went into hiding or fled the country. Higginson basically says, well, you know where I am. And he, in fact, tries to help concoct a plan to break Brown out of jail, which, of course, is foiled.
Of course, yeah.
But, he could have faced charges of treason.
Yeah.
Which is never brought up on. But it goes to show kind of where his heart is when it comes to the abolition movement. So in 1862, he's actually serving as a captain in the 51st Massachusetts Infantry.
Okay.
He's enlisted for a very short amount of time when a friend of his who's stationed in the Department of the South, a guy named Rufus Saxton, also from Massachusetts, he reaches out and says, hey, we've been recruiting this regiment of black men from the local area. And he sees him fit to be commander of this regiment. And with very short notice, Higginson books passage to the South Carolina Sea Islands and assumes command at a place called Camp Saxton, right there on the Beaufort River. And he kind of sets the precedent. He starts to, look at these company commanders with a more critical eye. Are these men actually treating their soldiers fairly?
Right.
Are they here just for the paycheck?
Right.
Or are their hearts truly in what we're doing here?
Right.
In fact, I have a really good quote from Higginson I want to share with you here. Once he starts or assumes command of the regiment, he actually keeps a pretty detailed journal. He also writes quite a few letters from camp. He's a very well-read orator, but also he's a monthly writer for the Atlantic.
Okay.
He's part of that transcendentalist movement we were talking about before.
Yes, okay, yeah.
Before we got started today. So this is one of his reflections once he establishes home in the camp. He says, all this is the universal Southern panorama when he's looking at the white canvas tents and the black soldiers with their scarlet trousers marching and training in camp. But he says, 5 minutes walk beyond the hovels and live oaks will bring one to something so un-Southern that the whole southern coast at this moment trembles at the suggestion of such a thing, a camp of a regiment of freed slaves. Interestingly enough, they're actually training on a former plantation where several of the soldiers had been enslaved prior to the war's start. So this plantation is turned on its head.
Like, yeah, I mean, can you imagine what that must be like for the formerly enslaved person here? You know, that, you know, you're nothing. You're a dog, basically. And then the next day you wake up and you're free, which has got to be mind-blowing. It's like, what do I do now? Right? And then you're being armed and trained to be a soldier in the United States Army. I mean, it's got to be just the most surreal thing.
Right. And it's not to say they didn't still experience, you know, hardships,
of course,
and obstacles. You know, of course, there are documented scuffles between black soldiers and white soldiers in the U.S. Army, because white soldiers, they see... Also in Glory. Yeah. I mean, it's one of the accurate depictions they do have in that movie is, you know, kind of the animosity that is bubbling up between these troops. Right. You know, these guys, some of these white soldiers, when they arrived in late 1961, you know, saw these people living in rags, and now they're seeing them in a U.S. Army uniform, and they weren't quite prepared for that, a lot of them. But that starts to change. Once they see these guys and how well they train, eventually they'll see how well they fight in the field. There's a big paradigm shift. They gain respect for them. Yeah, and there's a really great account of some of these men of the 1st South Carolina on the northern end of Port Royal Island, where they had actually established a skirmish line, which was basically maintained throughout the rest of the war. And they're relieving a Pennsylvania, I think, if I remember, it was the 50th Pennsylvania Infantry. And as they start to do the shift, one of the officers of the black regiment is talking to one of the white officers from the white regiment and says, you know, what are your thoughts on this? And he basically responds in the affirmative that they're here to fight just as we are. And that, I think, and that's by the summer of 1963. And it goes to show that, you know, they basically see these guys in the same boat at that point. Yeah. And sure, there are still dissenters. There's still people who are against it. But I think largely when you start to read these letters and contemporary accounts as time moves on, things are changing.
Do we have any accounts from the former slaves and what they thought on this transition into soldierhood?
Yeah, there's actually one. So here, I'll back up. The tricky thing with the men who are serving in, say, the 1st South Carolina or the 104th USCT or 128th USCT is a lot of these guys were born enslaved. Yeah. They were prevented by law from learning how to read and to write. So you're not seeing a lot of contemporary letters and journals coming out of their camps. Right.
And no one's going around saying, hey, what's this like? And recording it.
We'll have that, but who's recording it?
Right. Oh, okay. So no, that's what I'm saying. Nobody's actually putting pen to paper.
Mouth, right. Yeah. But, however, as you look later on, a great example is looking at soldiers' pension files. Now, of course, that's from later in life, but at that point, you are getting from the mouth of the soldier essentially an oral history.
Right. Okay.
But yes, there are accounts from guys doing newspaper interviews and such. You know, one of them is a guy named Prince Rivers, and Prince Rivers is he's a color sergeant actually in the 1st South Carolina. He was enslaved in Beaufort County, and he's actually literate by the time of the war. Somehow he did seek out an education and had an education and could write his name, etc. And he's interviewed several times by different newspapers and becomes kind of an unofficial spokesperson for the regiment as well. And, you know, he talks about, you know, running through their former enslavers with the point of the bayonet. He talks about black military service with this major sense of pride. In fact, when the regiment marches through the town of Beaufort in January of 1863, after Emancipation Day, he talks about marching through the town of Beaufort with the band of the 8th Maine Infantry playing in front of them. And he talks about the flag flapping in the wind, and he says, "Oh my God, I could have left this world altogether." He's so full of pride. Now being seen by people as men, as fighting men.
Yeah.
There's actually a really good account I want to share here with you. As we talk about kind of the shifting paradigm of white soldiers and their opinions of black soldiers. There's a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Oliver Beard. He was a commander of the 48th New York Infantry, but as the 1st South Carolina was still kind of coming together, he actually will lead an expedition of several companies of the regiment along the Georgia coast, destroying salt works, etc.
Okay.
So after the raid, which was successful, he says, "I have the honor to report that I have tried a portion of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. The colored men fought with astonishing coolness and bravery. I found them all I could desire, more than I'd hoped. I started from St. Simon's Island with 62 colored men and returned to Beaufort with 156 fighting men. As soon as we took a slave from his claimant, we placed a musket in his hand, and he began to fight for the freedom of others." And this is a guy who, there's actually several published accounts where he is kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. So, but this is an example of one of those people who's kind of won over when he actually sees them in combat on the battlefield.
How about their former masters, owners, had to have been crapping their pants?
If you were to ask them what their biggest fear was,
Yeah.
say in 1860, before the arrival of the U.S. Army, what do you think that would be?
A slave insurrection of some sort.
Exactly.
Yeah, sure.
That's the biggest fear of white men throughout the South, rich white men in the South.
Right.
Why do you think every larger southern city has some kind of white militia group that's been established, or has a substantial castle-like arsenal that's been established?
Right.
Because of what they had heard happened in
Haiti?
and what would become Haiti or Santo Domingo. Yeah.
Yeah, that had to be. And I wonder if they kind of maybe would have known before everybody else in the Confederacy that it was kind of over before it began, even though it was a long, hard war. Like, that first batch of plantation owners that just lost everything rather quickly compared to everybody else who were maybe further inland.
I think for them, it was a time of uncertainty.
Yeah.
We didn't know how this was all going to turn out. Nobody knew how it was going to turn out. The people who self-emancipated, ran away from the plantations inland and ran to the coast, they didn't know if they were going to end up free at the end of the day,
right?
At the end of the war.
No, of course not.
The people who were on the other end of the spectrum, who were coming down from, Boston, New York, Philly, and opening schools in a place where it was illegal to teach them how to read and to write.
Right.
If that area becomes Confederate-occupied territory, what happens to them?
Yeah.
And what happens to the people who are teaching? They're taking major risks in all this.
Sure.
And it's not like they have, they're stretched pretty thin, the Union force that's in the Department of the South. You have a couple thousand spread across 3 states.
Right. So it's not like they're really there.
They're really there.
You got a few thousand.
Right.
You don't know. You could be pushed back or
right. And you have of course, Confederates are concentrated more so around Charleston and Savannah, and a lot of the heavy action is happening in places like Virginia and Tennessee, etc.
Sure.
And I think that's also a reason why what is happening here in the Sea Islands has been largely overshadowed in the study of the American Civil War. You don't have Gettysburg or Antietam or Manassas or Shiloh or any of that kind of stuff happening down there. It's a lot of smaller scale actions. But really, I think what's happening down there, as I mentioned, is happening on a totally different plane, where this is kind of dictating what's going to happen, or laying out the blueprint for what's going to happen when all that's over, when the Antietam's and the Gettysburgs and Manassases have already happened.
It's like a laboratory almost of experiment.
In fact,
yeah,
they will call it the Port Royal experiment.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Genius.
Yeah. So they call it, it's almost like you thought of it.
It's almost.
So yeah, and they will call it the Portal experiment, and that's exactly how the United States government sees it. This will become a testing place for these things like black military enlistment, free labor, education, all those things we just discussed. All that stuff is playing out there in the Sea Islands from 1861 onward, and of course, it's a grand success. This basically becomes also, when we get into 1865, you have the Freedmen's Bureau established in March, and the Freedmen's Bureau is established essentially with the lifespan of a year, and I'll get to that in a second. But the Freedmen's Bureau is established with this idea of trying to get nearly 4 million people who were once enslaved kind of situated in a free society with building freedmen's schools. One of the first freedmen's schools established in the Department of the South was called Penn School. In fact, it was two white ladies from Philadelphia who came down and built a school system that began with just maybe less than a dozen students and grew to almost 200 in 4 years.
Wow.
And in 1865, once they had built their first schoolhouse, one of the first visitors to that schoolhouse is General O.O. Howard.
Oh, yes.
He sees what's happening here.
Okay.
Of course, around that same time, he's put in command of the Freedmen's Bureau, and this will become kind of the template for what are these freedmen's schools going to look like across the South once this war is over.
Interesting. Isn't that funny how that all works out like that?
Yeah.
There's no grand plan. You kind of just make it up as you go, and then it becomes a plan.
It all fell into place, though.
Yeah.
And, it wouldn't have happened. What?
No, I was thinking of our conversation before about people with the ordained by God thing, and I was just about to say it almost makes it sound like it was ordained by God. Yeah,
and a lot of people see that playing a role in it. Yeah, I mean, you have a lot of these Christian organizations too that will come in and play a part here as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, everything that's happening here in the South Carolina Sea Islands, this will kind of become the template that the Freedmen's Bureau will use moving forward. In fact, they even establish one of the first freedmen's banks in the entire country.
Oh, really?
Where, when they're working and they're saving their wages, this is a place where they can actually deposit those wages. This will become, when they establish the Freedmen's Bureau, they also establish a freedmen's bank.
See, that's interesting because that's another thing like you just, I don't think about is a bank account.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just take that for granted that I can go open a bank account. But they couldn't.
No.
That's amazing, yeah.
And it even, I mean, it gets... We'll talk about this in the future. But
right, we've got other episodes ahead.
Right. So I won't spoil it right now. But yeah, all the what people take for granted and what people kind of see as the basic necessities of life, all that needs to be spelled out. And what are the basic things that we take for granted? I think this kind of provides an opportunity to look at that, and it provides an opportunity for a lot of self-reflection.
Yeah.
The things that we might take for
You talking about us today or people back then?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, both.
Yeah. No, it does. I mean, it really does.
When someone asks the question, what does freedom mean to you? It's the freedom to do all those things.
Yeah.
That they weren't allowed to do.
Right. Without asking permission.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's the big thing for me is I don't have to ask permission.
Yeah.
And when I do, I go, why do I have to ask permission? And then I don't partake in it. So... yeah, right there. Oh, Richie's got
time for another cough drop.
Yeah, Richie's sick. He's got an upper respiratory infection, which is not contagious. I should have asked you that before.
I don't think. No, it's not contagious.
I don't think. Okay, great.
It started with apparently it started with allergies that just I don't know, moved into my lungs.
Right.
I don't know how it works. I'm not a doctor.
Well, I mean, stuff gets in you and then it stays there and it infects you.
It's not fun.
No, it is not fun at all. Not at all. Let me ask you a question before we go on. How's the volume on your headphones?
That sounds fine.
Okay.
I think.
Because it sounds like you're yelling, and that might help you with your...
I'm sorry, am I yelling?
Well, no, I'm just saying, because you're speaking, like, is this better?
Oh, that's much better,
yeah,
actually.
so now you can just talk at your regular voice.
Thank you so much.
There you go. All right, go ahead.
That's a lot better. Oh, thank you.
When you struggle to hear yourself, you yell.
I was yelling.
You were.
I apologize.
It's all right.
So anyway, what's happening here, as I mentioned, with the enlistment of black soldiers, with the start of the Freedmen's Bank, with the distribution of lands to freed people, these also have long-lasting ramifications too. Well, in fact, if you were to go to this region today, there are still quite a few African-American landowners who got that land through those tax auctions.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Wow. And they just passed it down.
Yep. And of course, there's also, once we get into the early 20th century, even late 19th century, there is a large amount of people who leave the area and head to northern cities during the Great Migration.
Sure.
A lot of people do lose their land. And of course, that stuff we'll get into much later on. But again, this is all kind of establishing that groundwork that will be in place for years to come, well after the war is over.
It's so fascinating to me because, I think of the war in many ways. It's very hard for me to shake the Hollywood image that's been burned into my brain about the war.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And while I think, obviously, they're movies, they can't be reliable sources for things. But then for example, the word contraband,
mm-hmm.
right? I never understood why that was the word for them until today. I probably heard it somewhere, but it just didn't sink in.
Right.
But I'm thinking of one of my favorite John Wayne movies, The Horse Soldiers. And they, they've taken Newton Station, and he says, we're gonna burn all the gather up all the contraband, burn but he means everything, not just people.
Right?
Because he's not gonna burn the people,
to stolen property that aren't people, right?
But Lukey, the slave of the woman that the plantation owning woman who they've kind of taken along with them. She hears the word and she goes, contraband, that's me, isn't it? Or ain't it, Miss whatever her name is? And she's scared because she thinks she's going to get rounded up and burned.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And so, but I never really, I don't know. It's just fascinating to me how.
Well, so kind of backing up though, that starts to shift as well. Like I said, with the Emancipation Proclamation, and a lot of people might even start Reconstruction in places with that, January 1st, 1863. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect, which, he kind of laid out the parameters in September of 62. If your arms are not laid down within 100 days, then, I'm freeing all the enslaved people that are in states and areas engaged in open rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
So, on January 1st, 1863, of course, we know the war wasn't over yet.
Sure.
This Emancipation Proclamation is going to go into effect in those areas where U.S. troops occupy, of course, this part of South Carolina being one of them. And they actually, you could say, probably have one of the first public readings of the Emancipation Proclamation there in Beaufort County at the camp of the 1st South Carolina Infantry. In fact, that morning, January 1st, they assemble about 5,000 people for this reading. They erected a grandstand for the reading of the proclamation. In fact, they're going to have a guy named Dr. William Henry Brisbane, who at one point had enslaved people in that region. He was actually from South Carolina, and kind of long story short, back in the 1840s, had received a pamphlet from an abolitionist society, basically arguing why he shouldn't own people, and he decides to lead a different lifestyle. Ultimately ends up freeing all the people that he had enslaved or inherited. And then he becomes an abolitionist himself.
Wow.
Ends up working for...
So that's the one guy a pamphlet worked on.
I don't know. I like to imagine there's more.
Do pamphlets work on you? Somebody hands you a pamphlet in the parking lot at the grocery store. You actually go, oh, I'm going to change my mind because you handed me a pamphlet. No, I mean, that must have been a really well-written pamphlet. or the guy had a heart.
They raised a good argument.
Yeah.
Why shouldn't own people.
Right.
So, but he actually ends up working for the federal government. He works for the Treasury Department. He's actually one of these tax commissioners who is pricing out the property that's been abandoned. But anyway, Higginson, who's helping lead the events that day on Emancipation Day, argues that Brisbane should be reading the Emancipation Proclamation because it will be a South Carolinian addressing fellow South Carolinians. And so he will read the Emancipation Proclamation. They actually present the regiment with their stands of colors. This for them, this is really the first, day of their true freedom. It's still a day that's celebrated. Again, this is part of the legacy of Reconstruction in that area,
Right.
and areas across the country. Emancipation Day is still celebrated as such in a lot of those communities. In fact, the night before, New Year's Eve is watch night. And so in a lot of the African American churches, people will gather and count down the minutes and the seconds until January 1st.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Now, later, after the war, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, black codes come about.
Yeah.
And is that federal or are those state?
Those are state.
Those are state.
And
then later that becomes Jim Crow. Is that how that works?
Well, and we'll talk about this more.
Yeah.
more
I mean,
so
I have
on.
a question back to what we're talking about, but I want to get this straight
So
first.
they kind of emulate slave codes from the pre-war period. And dictate things like you have to report to your white boss, and if you go missing, you have to have papers to prove that you have a job. You can be arrested for vagrancy or not even having a job.
Yeah,
you can't buy liquor or guns, things like that. They're eventually declared unconstitutional. But yeah, they also become kind of the groundwork for what would become the Jim Crow laws as well.
Is there anything during this period that we're talking about that the Union Army institutes that are similar in any way to black codes?
Similar, like you can't buy liquor. Things
Well,
like that,
I mean, do they? Not the soldiers, not the guys who end up fighting with them, but I'm talking about the former slaves within their purview. Are they allowed to roam free and do all the things that white civilians are allowed to do?
They still have to have, because of course, like for example, the Department of the South to move about freely, you do have to have papers.
Right, because you're in a war zone.
You're in a war
Right,
zone,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
So in that sense, you do have to have some kind
But
of.
so does everybody.
Everyone has
Right.
to, yeah. I can't think. Nothing comes to mind as far as restricting. I mean, of course, there are rules when you're in a military zone.
Sure. It's not the same as living in peacetime.
But saying race-based laws in that military zone, I can't think of any right now.
Okay.
In fact, if we're looking at, as we were talking about black military enlistment, this is one of the first places these guys have freedoms that they didn't have before.
Right.
Of course, things like being able to testify in a court against a white person.
Right.
That was unheard of before.
Right.
But now you can testify in a court martial.
But
you're not being paid the same.
Of course not.
That's not rectified till 1864. They're essentially being paid as laborers.
I guess that's one of the many sad things about black codes and Jim Crow is that there was, for a small number, I guess, a period of time where even though you had the restrictions of living in a military zone, you still had more freedom than you ever had. And then the war is over, the side that liberated you won, and the state that you're stuck in enacts these laws and these codes that restrict you again. You know what I mean? Like, what a tease that is. And especially if you fought for the country.
Well, that's kind of getting into the roller coaster of Reconstruction too. Like, after the war is over, we don't have necessarily a clear-cut path for what Reconstruction is going to look like. The President of the United States is assassinated in April of 1865.
Yeah.
So whatever plan he had for Reconstruction that's kind of out the window.
Right.
You know, you now have Andrew Johnson to deal with, and you know he does things like, you know, dismantle orders number 15. You know, we talked about 40 acres and a mule. That goes out the window. He is more focused on reconciliation over, you know, trying to form this basically new country from the ashes of the Civil War. And again, like I said, we'll get into that more so later on.
Yeah.
Because that's a whole other episode in itself, going between presidential and congressional Reconstruction. What were we going to say?
Well, no, go ahead, because I was going to move on to something else.
Okay. So, you know, like I said, talking about, say, Johnson. And by the way, if you haven't watched it yet, have you seen Manhunt?
I was just going to say, don't say Manhunt. Oh, my God. Well, I have watched about 5 episodes.
Okay. I only say that
hate
because there are, for as many things as I don't like, it does kind of raise the points and bring points to the modern public about people like Andrew Johnson and kind of his stance on Reconstruction.
Yeah, I figured that stuff they got right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, to an extent, yeah.
Well, I mean, to the point that, you know,
the basics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The rest of it is just so horrible. It's, first of all, Stanton as like a detective running around chasing after people is so stupid.
As me and my friend Jake would say, he racks up his frequent flyer miles.
During
the war,
right? Doesn't he go to Canada at one point? Like,
yeah, I believe so.
Like in like an hour, like he's like, you know, all right, let's hop in the car and go to Canada. He's just all over the place. It's just so dumb. It's so dumb. Anyway, all right, now I have 2 questions. It's a part A and a part B. One is there anything more about Reconstruction during the war that you want to add before we move on? And B, in episode 2 of Richie Condon's Reconstruction, maybe we should call it Reconstructing with Richie or something. I don't know. We'll figure it out. In episode 2, give us a little preview as to what we're going to cover there. So, A, anything else you want to add for this subject? B, what are you looking forward to in episode 2?
Sure. So there, I will add, you know, we talked about the Emancipation Proclamation, kind of laying the groundwork for freeing people and the slaves engaged in open rebellion, but that doesn't really, that doesn't solidify the freedom of people during the war either. And of course, it leaves a lot of people out in the border states, like Kentucky, for example. You know, it is not solidified until the passing of the 13th Amendment. And that kind of segues into B. The 13th Amendment is, you know, have you ever seen the movie Lincoln?
Of course.
Literally all about the 13th Amendment.
They should have called it 13th. Had nothing to do with Lincoln. I thought it was a biography. I was going to learn about his life. No,
I mean, it's his long-lasting legacy.
Of course.
You know, of course, a lot of people look at the Emancipation Proclamation as being the end-all, be-all.
Right.
But it's not until it's solidified in the 13th Amendment that it's codified in the U.S. Constitution that, you know, you can't own people in the United States of America, with the exception of punishment for a crime. And that's a big loophole that we'll actually kind of explore in the second episode.
Oh, okay.
That, you know,
maybe we'll call it Trouble with the 13th.
Well, you know, it's so look at it this way. You know, they're looking at you can't enslave people with the exception of punishment for a crime. So how about we find some crimes?
Yeah.
Like vagrancy, for example. And then what happens when they are arrested and put in the prison system?
Chain gang.
Right. I mean, when we think that, we think like the chain gangs of the 19th, 20th centuries. Yeah.
And what are they doing? Manual labor.
For how much money?
None.
Exactly. So,
and their whole day is regimented. They have no freedom of movement. They have,
Yep.
I'm so tempted to break into Sam Cooke right now.
That's all. That is all connected back to the legacy of Reconstruction.
See, and this is, for those of you who may be wondering, why is a Gettysburg show talking about Reconstruction? This is why, because this is all about getting a better understanding of our nation as it is, as it was, how it got where it is, and why we are the way we are.
I will also argue that there's a lot of, when you look at kind of the 30,000 foot view down, some of the key players of Reconstruction are here before, during, after the battle. I mean, O. Howard
big
commanding
one.
the Freedmen's Bureau.
Yeah.
Carl Schurz.
Howard University.
Oh, God, sorry. Yes, Howard University is named in his honor as well.
So much editing to do with cutting your coughs out.
I'm sorry.
Just teasing. All right, go ahead. It's okay, Richie. It's okay.
So, I'm so sorry if I get you sick.
No,
I'm just kidding. It's
you're not going to
contagious.
get me sick. I am impervious to sickness.
But Carl Schurz, is writing one of the first reports of the condition of the South once the war is over. He's reporting on atrocities being carried out against African Americans and their allies.
That's funny. Right here, Carl Schurz touring the South after the war in the service of the blah, 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 blah.
Right. And he publishes those accounts as well. You look at Thaddeus Stevens.
Mm-hmm.
I was just driving to the studio on my way here and saw a little monument to Thaddeus Stevens on the side of Baltimore Street.
That's right.
Thaddeus Stevens, is what many people would call at the time a radical Republican who's trying to pass, say, the 14th Amendment, which we'll again get into in the second episode, which is guaranteeing equality under the law and birthright citizenship in this country.
Mm-hmm.
So these Reconstruction amendments that are passed after the war are just as relevant today as they were back then.
Absolutely.
Part of the long-lasting legacy of Reconstruction.
All right, Richie. So we're going to leave it there. And then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about what would you call episode 2?
We'll say the immediate post-war years.
The immediate post-war years, 65 to...
We'll go 65 to 70.
To 70,
So
nice.
we're gonna get into the Reconstruction amendments. What is born out of the ashes of the American Civil War. These are probably the these years between 65 and 70. This is laying the groundwork for... This is kind of the high... Well, it goes from a low point to a high point.
Okay.
We're going from, as you mentioned, black codes that are being passed right after the end of the war, that white oligarchy trying to bring about the pre-war hierarchy,
Right.
to African American men actually holding office and creating new state constitutions by 1868, 1869.
Okay, I'm looking forward to that. So we have to schedule that soon because I'm very interested in all this stuff and I want to learn more. Also, there's also the reformation of the state governments, right? It's not just like everything goes back to normal, correct?
Right, and so you with these new state constitutions, that is remaking the state governments,
but also who can serve,
right?
Who can run for election and who can
you
serve?
have military departments that are established. When of course, like we were saying in the start of this episode, things don't just end at Appomattox with the surrender of the Confederate Army. People don't necessarily just lay down their arms and say, "Okay, we lost. We're going home. It's over." There's still grumblings.
We're friends again.
There's groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League that are formed out of this. That it's like the war is continuing to be fought.
Well, there's still battles, right? Liberty Place,
right?
Isn't that the White League that's part of that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the fighting continues, just not in an organized form. And like I said, it gets much more personal, much more violent.
Yeah. So for those of you out there like Barbara who say this is boring, probably, but not as boring as you think. It's very interesting, especially if you want. For me, it's like solving a mystery. The mystery is, how the hell did we get so effed up in this country? And this is helping me to solve that mystery.
Well, and I think I would argue it's probably the most misunderstood period in our country's history, even today.
No one ever talks about it.
Right.
It's like a paragraph and a half in a history book in school.
That is changing. I mean, in the last 10 years, 5 to 10 years, there's been so many more books related to Reconstruction and aspects of Reconstruction that, if you look in the right place, you'll find the information. And like I said, it's I don't know. I've come to find you can't talk about Civil War without talking about Reconstruction and vice versa. I find it just as fascinating.
Yeah, I'm learning that to be
more.
true. Yeah, it's very true. All right, Richie Condon, thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
For the due diligence for this episode. I'm looking forward to doing the rest of them. Ladies and gentlemen who are watching for free on YouTube right now, it goes private, not private, it goes unlisted, and it's available only to our first lieutenants right afterwards. But thank you for watching anyway, and we hope you would consider supporting what we do over here at Addressing Gettysburg by becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Addressing Gettysburg. And for those of you who are patrons, thank you very much for your continued support. God love you, and we will talk to you next time. Goodbye. All right, Richie. That's it. Let's see what everybody's saying here. Let's play with the people on the video.
There's a lot of comments on there.
There are a lot of comments. Let's see. I saw some good ones coming in about you, so we'll talk to the audience here for a bit. Rich, got to leave the hat on. We already did that one. Rich, looking forward to your Sacred Trust talk in July. Okay. Somebody's looking.
Photo of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see. Guitarzan says, I dig the carpetbaggers. Their suits were rad. Gene Hutchinson says, I haven't studied much about the Reconstruction because it's just so depressing. What a missed opportunity.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, it is. 6 Questions Len says, hello, everybody. I'm excited for this. I'm currently reading Eric Foner's seminal work on Reconstruction.
Nice.
What book would Rich recommend for beginners in learning the subject? Would you recommend that one as for the beginners?
Eric Foner's book is, I would still argue, is kind of the book on Reconstruction, if you want that crash course. But like I said, W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction in America is probably the first, like I said, true telling of Reconstruction as well. As you can, I don't know if you can see, it is quite a thick one.
Yeah, it's a thick one.
But highly recommend. I couldn't recommend this enough.
Can't recommend it enough. Sorry, my framing is all off here.
If you're looking for something specific to the South Carolina Sea Islands, Rehearsal for Reconstruction by Willie Lee Rose, which came out in the 60s as well.
Okay.
And like I said, there's a lot of great new scholarship coming out. There's a book that came out just a few months ago called Combee by Dr. Etta Fields Black.
What's it called?
Combee, C-O-M-B-E. It's actually the Combee River. And it's written around Harriet Tubman's raid in 1863, June of 1863, but explores a lot of the enslaved people in the South Carolina Sea Islands as well. So like I said, a lot of new stuff coming out all the time.
6 Questions Lentz, the man who knows everything. He says the 1st South Carolina were designated the 33 USCT in 1864.
That's right.
You didn't know that.
No, I didn't.
You didn't?
No, I did.
You did. You did or didn't?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I hope so. I didn't know it. Let's see. Well, I'd say you got some knowledge. Okay, that's the private. See, they have conversation with each other, and then I got to sift through it to see what is actually pertinent to the show. Here, 6 Questions says, could you explain the difference between the 54th Mass and regiments like the 1st South Carolina?
Yeah, so the 1st South Carolina, like I said, that's a regiment recruited strictly from the South Carolina Sea Islands all the way down to the Georgia, Florida coasts. I would say at least 99% plus formerly enslaved men. The 54th Massachusetts is largely recruited from the Northeast region. I mean, they have recruiters that are going out to places like Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, right. You name it. And
118 from this area. Did you know that?
Yeah, there's almost 50% of the regiments Pennsylvanians,
right?
Actually,
not even Massachusetts.
Yeah. So like when you watch Glory in the movie, they say this is the first Black regiment recruited for U.S. Army service, the first Northern Black regiment,
but also not made up of a bunch of runaways.
No,
in fact, a lot of them are professionals. A lot of them have been freed their whole lives.
Yeah, I mean, there's a handful of guys who were born enslaved, but
right.
Really a majority of the men would have been like Thomas,
right?
For example,
right?
Yeah,
Snowflake. Is that what he calls him?
What Denzel calls him?
No, yeah.
Yep.
Let's see here. The threat of slave insurrection was a huge preoccupation of the pre-war Southern white society, says 6 Questions Lens. 6 questions. You got to get a car so you can be on the show more often. Any info Barbara wants to know on peonage?
On
peonage.
Peonage?
Peonage, like you're a peon.
Oh, what
after
about?
the war. Well, I don't know what she's. Wait, any info on peonage after the war, which was SOT? S-O-T. I don't know. She might have been jogging when she wrote that, and we got some typos in there. Let's see if she clarifies if she's still watching. John B says, love these sessions. Thank you, John. I love that you love them. Thank you. Love you too. 6 questions says, Rich is so cool.
Oh, thank you.
Well, he's
You're
joking.
so cool.
He's joking.
Oh, well.
Yeah. No. Ghost of Sickles Legs is doing well. Oh, okay. There. Listen. 6 questions could listen to this all day. I'm heading to South Carolina now. I'll have to find the battlefield to visit, says John B. I was named after a cool boat. Sloop John B. I got that. That's good. Matt, move your camera. Thank you, Mike. That's the best Matt has looked on camera when it was not me. That's good. I hate you. All right. Let's see. What about the vampire hunter aspect of Lincoln? What about that? We don't really hear a lot about that. One
about
movie
him fighting vampires?
Yeah, they make one movie about it, but we really don't. There's not many books about it. I've never heard Harold Holzer say anything about that. The vampire aspect. Doris Kearns Goodwin didn't mention it at all. You're right. You want a cough drop?
I'm out of cough drops.
I have nicotine lozenge. It's just going to make you cough worse. It burns. Okay, wrestling referencing. Okay, there we go. And wait, Barbara says, thanks, Rich and Matt. But she must have gone. Thunder at the Gates, great book.
That is a great book.
On the 54th.
By Doug Egerton.
I have it. Read it. I own it.
You own it. Great book.
I haven't read it yet. I have a whole bunch. We went and saw, I forget who it was, somebody at the Cumberland Valley Civil War Roundtable talk, and he was talking about the 54th.
Okay.
And
was it him?
I don't remember. I couldn't tell. I'm so bad with names. I don't remember your name until you're right in front of me.
All right.
Yeah. But anyway, he was listing all these books, and I was sitting there on Amazon looking them up and putting them in my list, and I just bought them all. So I got a whole section on 54th and Colored Troops.
And now you just got to read them.
And now I just have to read them. But before I do that, I have to find the time to read them.
You'll get there.
Someday. Yeah, when I'm dead or retired or in the hospital for something. Eric says, great show. Enjoyed everything I could listen to between trying to get work done. Thank you, Rich. Thank you very much. All right, that's it from everybody there. Addressing Reconstruction. That's not a bad idea. You want your own show, Richie?
Oh, boy.
Would you like that? Richie, would you like your own show?
When you find time to read all those books, I'll find time to have my own podcast.
Okay, very good. Fair enough, as they say. All right, that's it, patrons. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Talk to you next time.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You know what this song is called?
What?
Marching Through Georgia.
It's a real banger.
Today's opening theme is written and performed by Colin Southfield.
It's the end credits. Sorry, I thought it was the actual song.
I get a
P.
Yeah, really
All right,
bad.
well, hold on. Let me...